In this video, we'll be breaking down the basics of PC building. For a start, you're going to need some tools. First thing I'd recommend is an anti-static wristband. It's worn on your wrist with a metal tongue thing on a rubber wire. This is to connect you to the case's metal so you stay grounded. This prevents static electricity from ruining your computer's components while you're hands-on with the build. Next, you'll need to find any old Phillips head screwdriver, preferably one with a long neck and a magnetic tip. This is so that if you drop a screw, it's 1,000 times easier to get it back out of the case. Finally, some zip ties. For cable management, because no one wants their fresh new PC to look like it fell on the floor. Now onto the components. The case is pretty much the skeleton holding everything in place. Cases come in a gazillion and one different shapes and sizes, which is why it's so important you choose the right one. And when choosing a case, it really only comes down to the size, which is marked in a measurement known as ATX. So say if you have a micro ATX case, that means you'd need a micro ATX motherboard. Anything bigger and it won't fit the case. Motherboard. If the case is the skeleton, I guess you could say the motherboard is your nervous system. It connects everything together and allows everything to function in unison. There are tons of different motherboards out there and they all come packing different features. Probably the most important thing to find out first is your ATX sizing. Say if you already bought that micro ATX case, then you're going to need to get a micro ATX motherboard, or else good luck trying to fit something big in something small. Next thing to sort is your memory slots, how many and what type. I'd recommend only using DDR4 as you're going to be using outdated tech, resulting in slower speeds with anything else. Last thing to check is your GPU connection. If you bought a PCIe graphics card, then you're going to need to get a motherboard with a PCIe GPU slot. The CPU. The CPU is the brain of your computer, sending signals through the nervous system, the motherboard, to make everything work in unison. When coming to the CPU, you have two mainstream options. For processors, Intel or AMD. Intel is the best overall choice as it's arguably a lot more versatile in every way. In saying that, there are plenty of options with Intel processors, from Core i3s and all the way up to 10th gen i9s. But for about 99% of general work, the most you'd need is a base level Core i5 processor from Intel. CPU cooling. With CPU cooling, there are only really two options: heatsink cooling with fans or water cooling with a liquid cooler. Your cheapest and best option is heatsink cooling, as water cooling is 1, costly, and 2, prone to messing up. If it does mess up, or is incorrectly installed and leaks through your entire computer, it's not as easy as replacing the cooler, because your whole thing would be bust. Whereas with the heatsink cooler, if it does break, it's as easy as thermal paste, 4 screws and a new fan. The RAM. RAM can be compared to the computer's muscles, in the sense that the more you have, the stronger you are. With RAM, the more gigabytes of it you have, the faster your computer can run tasks. First thing to consider is RAM type. It's not worth covering all the different types as most are outdated, so it's just best to stick with DDR4. Next thing is RAM combinations, that being motherboard slots and gigabyte amounts. You can get as low as 4 gigabytes per stick or as high as 32 gigabytes a stick. Realistically, the most you'd need is about 8 to 16 gigabytes. Anything else is overkill. The most cost-effective solution would be to get 2 4GB sticks of DDR4 RAM or one 8GB stick. And with slots, mainstream motherboards will generally have 2 to 4 slots. With 2 slots, it's pretty self-explanatory. But if you have 4 slots and 2 RAM sticks, then the way it's installed matters more. So if there are 4 slots, the 2 sticks need to go in slots 1 and 3. But if there are 4 sticks, it doesn't matter. And if only 1 stick, then it goes in the first slot. The GPU. The GPU is mainly used for gaming. Say if you're looking to run a game on max settings, you might get an entry-level 1060 Ti. And if you wanted to go crazy, you might do a 2070 RTX. Aside from that, they aren't really important as modern day CPUs have all onboard graphics drivers. The PSU, the power supply. The PSU is pretty easygoing unless you're running a crazy over-the-top build that requires an insane amount of power, which most people aren't. You only really need to look out for 2 things: a decent true voltage output and making sure the CPU and PCIe connections have the same pattern from your power supply to the actual motherboard. Case fans. Case fans are only needed if you opted for a heatsink cooling over liquid. Case fans are basically all the same, so it doesn't really matter which you choose. It's more up to your own taste. Just make sure it fits your motherboard case fan connections.